100 years ago, when America's cities were undergoing very rapid urbanization, a new idea came to the fore in terms of land use regulation called zoning. And as zoning was adopted, as it was in Los Angeles in the early 1920s, it was adopted here by Citizen Initiative in Portland, it was subject to constitutional challenges. People believed it violated state or federal constitutions. Mr. Miller in Los Angeles wanted to build a fourplex in a newly established single-family residential zone. And this became the litigation that went to the California Supreme Court to test the validity of residential zoning. And this is what the California Supreme Court concluded, among other things. But few persons, if given their choice, would, we think, deliberately prefer to establish their homes and rear their children in an apartment house neighborhood rather than a single-family neighborhood. This was the origin, and by the way, this is characteristic of many other Supreme Court determinations, finding that residential zoning was, in fact, constitutional. And over the next century, residential zoning is elaborated greatly, restricting the types of housing and separating them by really the income of people going to afford to live in the types of housing, setting height and bulk requirements, lot size requirements, and even in cases, minimum sizes for the homes. This is the zoning for Winnetka, a suburb of Chicago. And on this map, you'll see the light green color. You have to have 48,000 square feet, 1 acre, to have a house there. The next largest size, or smallest size, is half an acre. And you may have trouble even seeing the light blue and purple at the center. That's where multifamily housing is. So zoning was used quite deliberately to separate the types of housing based really on the kind of housing people could afford. So manufactured home parks in their own zone, multifamily in its zone, townhomes, and then up increasing lot size. Segregating people by the kind of housing they could afford is separating by income and therefore separating by race. So it's not surprising that this system has been called, in the seminal work by Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, American apartheid. Now, there were other forms of regulation and practices, including the Federal Housing Authority's underwriting manual, which determined what mortgages were safe for reinsurance by the federal government. So this is section 233. If a neighborhood to retain stability, it's necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. So the red areas, this is a map of Portland, areas are considered unsuitable for mortgage insurance because there were black people and brown people living in them. And other federal policies, including a preference for providing infrastructure investments, whether it's freeways or sewers or water, in suburban locations. So these things combine together to create the landscape we know today, one in which there's a high level of segregation of housing through government regulation, government interventions. Meanwhile, the American family, and this picture is taken from that era when America was great. 37% of the households were 1 or 2 persons in 1950, 46%. And 2015, 62%. So almost 2 out of 3 households, and certainly urban areas, are 1 or 2 persons. Meanwhile, the houses, as the family size shrank, the houses were growing. 282 feet in 1950, 478 in 1970, 791 in 1990, 924 in 2010, and 1,058 square feet per person in single-family homes in 2015. So this is an image from Levittown. It actually looks remarkably like a picture of my family from this same period. So that Levittown home was 750 square feet, which means today a person in the single-family homes being built now has more space than this entire family had in their home. The consequence of this regulatory system and incentives was very low density patterns of development that are continuing now. That means we cover large parts of the landscape with very low density housing, which is economically segregated, and that has very serious consequences. That includes obesity epidemic, directly tied to development patterns where people can't walk or bike to access daily needs, air pollution from the driving to disconnected or low density housing from the commercial uses, schools, and employment places through zoning are separated. The destruction of farm and forest land and natural areas, And the fact that we drive so much to get to from our home and to work means that we're changing the climate of our entire planet. In Oregon, now 45 years ago, we had a visionary governor and a lot of visionary people who said, we want to have a different approach. We want to grow in a completely different way than the American standard. So among other things, every city in Oregon has an urban growth boundary. In fact, there's several cities' urban growth boundaries shown on this map that have populations considerably smaller than this room. Now, what people, if they know one thing about the Oregon planning program, it's this. This is the Portland metro region. Here's the urban growth boundary. Now, I have to say this because it comes up every single time we talk about it. They say, well, if you constrict land supply, you'll drive up home prices. Everyone understood this from the beginning. So under state law, every 5 years, every city has to reconsider its land supply to make sure there's enough land for housing and for jobs. And in the case of our regional government, it's an amazing, sophisticated, and rigorous review. All of this information is online, and I doubt there's another metropolitan region in the country that does a housing need analysis of this rigor with this kind of data and sophistication. So yes, the land supply is maintained, so there's always a 15 to 20-year supply of land. But another part of the planning program was to increase housing choices across all cities. And this included a direct reform of the kind of zoning I described before, which we call exclusionary zoning, because it excludes so many people and types of housing. Every government had to zone land for all types of housing. That included manufactured home parks and manufactured homes, apartments, and so on. In our region, it more than tripled the supply of land needed for apartments. Home rule was overruled. Home rule powers could not block affordable housing projects. And in our region, there were minimum density standards for new residential development. So this is an illustration of the effect of those laws. This is the average vacant single-family home lot as developed over time. So we went back from a quarter acre back to 5,000 to 6,000 square feet, which was sort of standard in American cities. There were also procedural reforms, no more subjective standards of review. If you were a city or county, you couldn't say fits in with the character of the neighborhood. You had to have height, bulk, kind of numeric standards. There's a 120-day limit for making a local decision. We had a new Land Use Board of Appeals to assure consistent interpretation of these requirements. And the state did not leave it to local discretion, but reviewed all of the local plans and regulations to make sure they implemented these efforts. And as Emily said, Portland Metro, our regional government, went farther in 1997. Don Morissette, a home builder, was on the council, and he introduced a region-wide regulation requiring all local governments to authorize accessory dwelling units. Now, they were still subject to a lot of local regulatory barriers, and we're still overcoming them. But this was visionary 20 years ago. The city of Portland has gone further on its own. Duplexes are permitted on each corner lot in single-family residential zones. Sharply decreased parking requirements for multifamily housing. In fact, there are office buildings, apartments, office buildings and hotels under construction in downtown Portland, no parking required. Greatly reduced ADU requirements. You'll hear more about that later. So what happened? Well, the market has responded across the region. We have a big surge in housing supply other than single-family residential. And by the way, some of these images are of affordable housing projects. Includes in the suburbs, mixed into neighborhoods, things that are adapted as multifamily housing, infill even on single-family lots, and take advantage of skinny lots. And we even had an experiment here from National Home Builder building microhomes. So the consequence of this is what you see, a map of 100,000 units, permits for 100,000 housing units, and the outer line is the urban growth boundary. One of the things that's remarkable about this is that the dark blue, by the way, are apartments, multifamily, is it's scattered across the entire landscape. So the growth is not concentrated in the edge as in other regions, but throughout our developed area. In fact, I think 60% of the housing now is infill or redevelopment. The consequence is that at a metropolitan scale, we grew very differently than other regions. This is a comparison of growth increment of 500,000 people in the 1990s between Charlotte, North Carolina metropolitan region and the Portland region. And if you can remember the shape of the urban growth boundary, you can actually pick this out on the map of Portland. One of the great consequences was, this is a headline from 15 years ago, income segregation dropped significantly, and therefore racial and ethnic segregation dropped significantly. Direct result of these policy initiatives to reduce exclusionary zoning, allow the market to supply housing. So that was great. We were making progress. Then it was fun for a while to be hip and cool. We were used to being obscure, dark, rainy, and all of a sudden we were in. And that meant we were a magnet. And it wasn't just about coming here young to retire. It was a great place to start a new business. And we had a great influx of people who had not been educated at the public's expense here in Oregon. And it was a dramatically rapid change. So look at this headline from the Portland Tribune. By the way, yesterday's paper's headline is about accessory dwelling units. 14% increase in 1 month. These are maps from Metro, so these are darker colors or rents between above $1,300 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. This is what happened in 5 years. So it was an explosion, and that's apartments and then home prices. Portland followed Seattle, this is a headline from earlier this year, as the biggest annual increase in single-family homes, Denver third, and Dallas fourth. And this was harder for us because unlike the other, these other regions, we actually have lower incomes here, more blue-collar people, lower percentage of people with college education. So we have this huge spike in prices, lower incomes. If misery loves company, we do have a lot of it. Whether it's Washington, or Austin, or Denver, or Boston, $400,000 statewide for a single-family home in Massachusetts, and in California, $500,000 is now the median home price. And you can see here home prices jumped as much as 75% in San Jose, San Diego, and San Francisco in the past 5 years. Average single-family home in San Jose is now about $1 million. So, Emily, take us through the next chapter. Thank you.
Great, are we using? Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Robert. Robert gave you a little bit of the history and the context. I'm going to kind of start with where we are today and provide a little more context on the housing market as we see it today and some of the challenges and opportunities that, that we face. Sure, is the clicker? I'm not using the clicker. So not only have we, Metro was created in 1978 to manage the urban growth boundary, and not only do we manage the growth boundary, but we also do a lot of work to be really intentional about how we grow and where we grow. This map is our 2040 growth concept, which was adopted in 1995. And is aimed at focusing growth in urban centers and corridors around high-capacity transit. In the 80s, our region was really forward-thinking, took highway money, reinvested it into transit. We now have 60 miles of light rail across the region, and we're really focusing development strategically around those centers and corridors. We've and all of that planning, as Robert described, has paid off. We're consistently rated one of the most livable places in the country. We have people moving here from all over the country and businesses following them. So, but all of that success also has a cost. And this is a great graphic that describes a concept an economist at the state, Josh Lehner, came up with. Oops, sorry. Called the housing trilemma, which is the idea that there's a tension between high quality of life, a strong economy, and our desire to remain affordable. And so he looked at 3 indices related to livability, the economy, and affordability measured in terms of income as a ratio to income to housing costs. And as you can see, I think If Portland was ever a place where young people came to retire, that is no longer the case. If there are any young people here looking for a place to retire, it looks like Youngstown, Ohio might be a good place to check out. But I also wanted to show this slide because I think if you look at the cluster of cities in the lower left portion, those are a lot of the places that you see represented here today. We are all looking for creative ways to make sure residents from all income ranges and stages of life are able to establish themselves in neighborhoods with high opportunities to work and play and thrive, and that we're able to benefit from having diverse communities. This chart shows the cumulative increase in renter and owner incomes compared to housing costs across the 7-county metro area. Since 2006, we've seen a 90% increase in rents, while renter incomes have only increased 48%, so nearly doubled. And Robert showed you those maps. I've got the same maps, and you can just see this kind of over time. The most pale yellow, if you just follow that as it recedes out to the edges and disappears, those are one-bedroom apartments that rented for under $700. And this is another map, another way of looking at that, that I think is a very powerful map. It's not up to date. This is 1990 to 2010, but these are trends that have or that have continued through this decade. As more and more people have moved to our region and are seeking walkable communities, we've seen an inverse in housing prices from the center of our region, closest to the urban core, to the outer edges. And those changes have corresponded to demographic changes that show the displacement of people of color from the loss of populations of color in the inner areas, that's the yellow, and then the blue represents percent change increase in people of color in the region. And this has affected long-established communities, including our African American community, which historically experienced several rounds of displacement as a result of redlining and urban renewal. And these trends are not unique to Portland. They've taken place and are taking place across the country and in cities all of you are from. They've been particularly hard felt here, in part because of the lack of basic tenant protections across the state. And also, and this is also consistent with other places in the country, because we really underbuilt during the region, and people did not stop moving here. So during the recession, we had a 22,000 unit deficit of housing compared to population growth in the region. And we know that these are long-term trends that are not going to turn around, and part of why we know that is it is still much more relatively affordable to buy a home in Portland than in any of our neighboring cities on the West Coast. So longtime residents who are looking to buy a home are now competing with an influx of people who have higher incomes. We're expected to grow by 2 million people. We're going to add 2 million people by 2035, and as Robert alluded, the households of the future will be older, they will be smaller, and they will be slightly lower income, in part because the household size is smaller. So all of these trends point to increased demand for accessory dwelling units and other forms of small housing. So I'm going to pivot now and just briefly tell you a little bit about what Metro is working on in response to the housing crisis. This is a 4-part framework that we've developed in collaboration with partners and in conversation with partners across the region to describe what we think is a collaborative and balanced approach to equitable housing. First, mitigate displacement and stabilize communities. We need basic renter protections, strategies to preserve existing affordable housing, expand access to entry-level homeownership opportunities. Second, maximize and optimize resources for affordable housing. Representative Kenny Geyer mentioned the document recording fee effort. There have been a number of other efforts at the state level and also in the city of Portland to increase dedicated resources for affordable housing. But one of the things that we see at the regional scale is that our region is home to 67,000 renters who pay more than half of their income toward housing costs. And more than half of those renters renters live outside of the city of Portland in the rest of the 3-county region that Metro oversees. And so the need is distributed across the region, yet 94% of dedicated local resources for investing in affordable housing are concentrated in the city of Portland. So that's something that we are exploring and looking for. Are there creative strategies to expand resources beyond Portland? And finally, or 2 more strategies, leverage growth for affordability. So thinking about ways we can capture value from all of the investment that we've attracted to our region. For example, as we are planning new light rail systems, looking at ways that we can get ahead of the investment that those public investments are going to attract, to develop new tools and strategies for being sure we are those investments primarily benefit residents with lower incomes and who need them most, and that people are able to stay in their communities and also thrive. And finally, the reason we're all here today to talk about increasing and diversifying housing supply. And that's really what our Build Small Coalition is looking at, is ways to add new housing options to the neighborhoods where we're seeing the greatest demand for housing. So through our initiative, we're convening conversations, we're redirecting resources that we have at Metro, including planning grants that we give to cities and counties to help them plan for a range of housing options, transit-oriented development grants that help developers build housing, including affordable housing that is close to transit stations, exploring opportunities for regional funding and policy solutions, and convening the Build Small Coalition. And the coalition was initially formed as the Space Efficient Housing Work Group by Oregon DEQ in 2009. And I want to thank Jordan Palmieri from DEQ for starting that effort in collaboration with Cole and Eli, who will tell you a little bit more about what that group has accomplished over the years. We have picked up the baton, Metro has picked up the baton from DEQ last year, and with their support are convening public, private, and nonprofit partners to identify ways that we can all work together to expand access to smaller housing across the region and across the state. So we're looking at ways to reduce regulatory barriers, financial innovation strategies, homeowner education and outreach, and partnerships to think about ways we might partner with community development organizations to create more affordable small housing. I'm going to skip this because we talked about it. So we currently have 2,737 permitted ADUs as of my most recent data across the Metro region. And this is new data that we just got that includes 51 ADUs that are outside of the city of Portland. We have a lot of staff and elected officials here from other smaller cities across the region who are interested in replicating Portland's success. And there's a lot of interest in doing that. But we do have some ADUs that have been built. There's still a lot of regulatory and financing barriers to be overcome so that we can see the same scale of ADUs as we've seen in Portland. And this just shows the range of ADU types, and the most common being in yellow, new construction that's detached, and in orange, conversions. So some of the regulatory barriers that are most common in our region and that I imagine are consistent with other cities and counties across the country, high system development charges, which are impact fees for parks, water, sewer, and transportation, high off-street parking requirements, so requiring homeowners to add off-street parking when they are building an ADU, setbacks for existing structures like garages to be converted, setback requirements, owner occupancy requirements, requiring that the owner of the primary home also occupy either the home or the ADU, and rigid design standards. And so as part of the coalition, one of the things Metro is working on is a code audit of the cities and counties in the Metro region to identify what the biggest regulatory barriers are, and then to develop both workshops for our local planners and policy staff, as well as education and outreach programs to support homeowners across the region in exploring ADU strategies. And then the other focus that the coalition has identified is we've done a lot of research to understand and DEQ has led a lot of great research to understand the environmental benefits of ADUs. I think there's still a lot of questions about the affordability and equity benefits. So one thing we know from previous ADU owner surveys is that ADUs are, in general, being rented for below market rate rents in their area, and about 20% of them are rented for free or for far less than market rate. So we imagine that those are being rented to friends or family members for a very low or zero cost. There are also benefits, including allowing for intergenerational housing, families to age in place, and finally thinking about, are there opportunities for ADUs to provide regulated affordable housing? And we'll hear more throughout the day about initiatives in our region and across the country that are trying to do that. And finally, ADUs provide entry-level opportunities for contractors. So thinking about strategies to increase and diversify our pipeline of construction workers. Part of the reason we didn't build enough during the recession is because we have a kind of contractor pipeline problem. So finding ways to bring more people into the construction business and more diverse people. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eli and Cole, who are going to tell you a little bit more about how we've jump-started the ADU market in Portland.
It's so great to be here with so many people. This is awesome. ADUs are all about stories, and if you'll pardon a little bit of navel gazing, which Portland is guilty of a lot in planning issues, that's what we're going to do now and share how Portland came to where we are today for accessory dwelling units. Portland is largely covered with single-family zoning, despite all the great things Metro does to encourage us to do otherwise. 45% of our land area is single-family zoned. That's up from 20% when we started zoning the city in the 1920s. Meanwhile, multifamily zoning in Portland has gone down threefold from when we started zoning it. So if you're trying to find a place, if you can't afford a big house or on a full-size lot, or you don't want a big house, your options are slim here. And when I see all this yellow on the map, I see fertile ground to build a lot of ADUs. And most cities have much higher percentages of their land area covered with single-family zoning than we do. So it's good to know our history, though, because we didn't just jump on this and snap make it happen. Before 1996, ADUs were allowed by right. There was no minimum lot size, no off-street parking requirement. They could be as big as a primary house. They could only be in northeast Portland, where we had an A overlay zone. You could do internal conversions. No owner occupancy was allowed. Sorry, it was required to be owner occupied. And you had to match the existing house in Portland. And I'm not sure how impact fees were handled. And let's see what Portland did. We saw 50 permits for ADUs from 1981 to 96. 15 years, that's 3 a year. So in 96, Portland said, let's try and liberalize the rules a little bit so we actually get some of these on the ground. So we allowed them citywide. We allowed internal ADUs, detached ADUs, additions. You could even take an existing small house and make it the ADU for the new house you're going to build on the lot. We dropped the owner occupancy requirement. We changed the size cap so it could be 800 square feet or 30% or a third the size of the main house, whichever was less. And at some point during that time, we assessed impact fees of half of what you'd pay for a house. Now, for most people in other parts of the country, you might look at this and say, oh my God, the sky's going to fall. We're going to be swarmed with these things. Did ADUs blast off in Portland? Nope. 15 years, 20 or 30 a year, with a regulatory environment that you would think would make them jump out of the ground. So then some folks got a little organized, coming out of the build it green world, the environmental perspective, and lobbied the city to make a couple changes. One of them was to change the size cap to be 3/4 the size of the main house, because with 1/3 the main house size, you basically, if a 1,000 square foot house, you're not going to build an ADU that tiny. So it became really a small house penalty. You had to have a big house to build an ADU. And we got the impact fees waived. And then we started seeing a little traction. And then in 2014, Portland did another code update, smaller, to level the playing field between detached accessory structures, where some people were gaming the system to do that and not put a kitchen in and like plug in a range afterwards, versus accessory dwelling units. Also to level the playing field between garages and accessory dwelling units. If you're going to have a detached structure tucked on a property line, doesn't matter if a car's in there versus a person living in it. So we changed design compatibility to be an easier thing to meet. And also, instead of having to match the design of the main house, which is what the rules used to say, if you had an existing house with T111 siding, no trim around the windows, you had to match that with your ADU or go through a, so you make fugly houses, you know, replicated fugly ADUs. And so we got rid of that rule, and now you still can either match the house or you can go through some prescriptive design, community design standards. And numbers have increased. And now we're looking at some code updates I'll talk about in a minute that might let us numbers climb higher. And this should be noted, this is all done with really awful financing options. You have to have a lot of money in your back pocket to build one of these things. There'll be sessions later on today to talk about some ideas to open that up further. So it's not just the regulations. Clearly, the uptick of ADUs in Portland happened at a time when regulation change was very small. Waiving the impact fee was a big, important step, and psychologically it was huge for first-time homebuyers, but that's not all that was going on. So what else was going down in 2009 and 2010? Well, one thing is we were not in a housing boom. We were in a recession then. One of the reasons they waived SECs is because the home builder said, just toss us a bone, we can't build anything in this town. The city had sponsored really well-attended green building tours, Build a Green tours, for 10 years, and had some good experience with market transformation efforts in trying to get the building sector to take up new models of construction. And those were sort of on the wane, but those tours included sometimes an accessory dwelling unit here and there, or a tiny house, which were like the most popular thing on the tour. So we had experience with that. Meanwhile, some green building people thought, you notice that there are all these LEED homes coming out of the ground that were 5,000 square feet. And some people in the green building community thought that's not quite right. There was also a lot of code dodging happening. Portland had the Wild West if you wanted to build a detached accessory structure. But if you actually wanted to make an ADU out of it and put a kitchen in there, then you're going to pay your impact fees, design match, height limits, all those things. So a lot of people were skipping out on the official rules and doing it under the radar screen. Martin did a great study showing that for every ADU that was legally built, 3 to 4 were illegal. It's much bigger than that in some other cities. And this is just ones marketed on the multiple listing service. I mean, there are many others. It's probably an underestimate. And then a group of us, sort of in the green housing community, got together. Things start in small places at Lucky Lab Pub and in a living room. And started to figure out how can we encourage smaller houses. That was frustrating for green builders. And luckily we met Jordan Palmieri at that time, who was studying this exact issue at DEQ and finding what you heard from Melissa Kennegeyer, the environmental best thing you can do for green building is to just build smaller. That led to some City Hall advocacy, which got us the chance to reduce from the way the assistant development charges and do some initial changes that you saw in 2010. Another thing we did was we recognized online there was all kinds of tiny house porn back then already. And if you did a search for small home plans, you saw almost nothing under 1,200 square feet. So we, Martin Cole and I, started accessorydwellings.org as a way to share real stories of built ADUs, not concept designs, but real built ones, and also use it as a forum to share research findings, appraisal guides, tour information as we started putting those together, videos, case studies. Linda wrote lots of case studies that DEQ helped sponsor so that we could just share what we learned about ADUs with anybody who wanted to read about it. And that has continued to grow till today. I'm going to give it over to Cole now.
So I'm going to continue this, this talk about the non-regulatory aspects of spurring ADU development in Portland. So I'm going to dive a little bit more into the SDC waiver because clearly this played a pivotal role in helping to spur ADUs. And so SDCs, system development charges, are a one-time tax, essentially, that anybody adding a housing unit to a piece of property must pay to offset the infrastructural burden that they're adding to the city's water, sewer, parks, transportation systems, and a lot of cities have these. So the SDC waiver represents something that maybe some cities could potentially try if they wanted to spur ADUs, but maybe they don't have SDCs or residential impact fees. So what did the SDC waiver do specifically in Portland that worked here, and how could that be applied in other cities? Well, it was a great marketing ploy. Number one, it was a time-limited incentive that was available, and that kind of prompted a lot of people who maybe had thought about building an ADU to think about doing it now instead of putting it off. Number two, it reduced the capital barrier. One of the largest barriers to ADU development, as we'll hear time and time again today, is the cost of building them. They're really expensive. So simply any way to significantly reduce the upfront capital cost is going to help a lot. And number three, it showed earnest governmental support of this form of housing. So this is a hugely kind of psychologically challenging and risky endeavor for a homeowner to invest this much money into building this form of housing. They've never built housing before. And so anything that shows that the government really's got your back and that they're going to support you and they're not going to try to make this challenging for you is really helpful from a homeowner's point of view. So any kind of time-limited, kind of large financial incentive that a city could provide could potentially be used to spur ADU development if the regulations are reasonably good, which they aren't in most cities. So common barriers to ADU development. So we're going to hear these themes time and time again today. Are regulatory barriers, educational barriers. A, what are these things? Never heard of these things. And B, how do I build these things? And C, they're really expensive. So even if I really wanted to build one, I don't have the cash to do it. So these are the three big buckets of barriers that you're going to hear about time and time again today. I'm going to focus in on the educational barriers because that's my forte. So the average ADU developer, this is kind of the take-home message of the whole presentation right here, is an amateur homeowner developer. This is a thing that makes ADUs distinct from every other form of housing that is built. No other form of housing in the United States is built by homeowners who've never built housing before. So a lot of the efforts that we've done in Portland have been in recognition of that fundamental distinction that differentiates ADUs from every other form of housing. These are average ADU developers. Emily's up here. And these ADU developers are probably, most likely, they work full-time. They're probably middle income. And I say that because if you were super loaded, you probably wouldn't bother building an ADU. You probably wouldn't have the motivation to do it because most people are building an ADU because of financial reasons, the income potential. So you're probably middle income, you probably work full-time. And you've probably never built housing before, so you have no idea what you're about to get into. So this is kind of the market that we have to think about, equipping these people with the skills and resources that they need to build these things. So I'm going to go back to the Space Efficient Housing Work Group that Eli and Emily mentioned, which started around 2009 and was started by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And Jordan, is Jordan here today? Yeah, somewhere. Oh, there he is. Thanks, Jordan. So I'm going to talk about some of the efforts that the Space Efficient Housing Work Group did that were really interesting and pivotal. The Space Efficient Housing Work Group was a group of advocates, industry practitioners, and governmental people who were interested in fostering more ADUs. So the first one big initiative that they worked on was the first ever statistically valid survey of permitted ADUs and ADU owners ever done in the United States. And we were able to do that because we had a high concentration of ADUs and most cities didn't. So this survey enabled us to actually know real things about ADUs that we had all, I say like the collective urban planning, profession has made all these assumptions about ADUs, but we didn't know things for sure until we had this study. And now we just have one data point that says things about ADUs that we didn't know before. But it would be great to see a lot more surveys like this as ADUs become popularized. But now we know things like, for example, how much they cost, who are building these things, what are the biggest barriers to development? How long do they take? All these things, we actually have real data now to back up our policy ideas and projects to support ADUs. Among the things that we had assumed about barriers to ADU development was confirmed in this survey, that indeed financing is a huge barrier. So this coalition was in part responsible for funding the research that went into looking at what local banks and credit unions do have loans that can be used for developing ADUs. There's not great options, but there's some. You can use home equity lines of credit. You can use cash out refi, and actually, there are a few banks like Umpqua Bank that offer construction loan financing that can be used for ADUs. So how do you know about those things? If you're an average homeowner, you have no idea where to start with this stuff. So that's a great little guide for homeowners who are looking at using conventional financing options. A more wonky topic that is also incredibly important, and we need to see a lot more research on this nationally, is appraising of ADUs. Appraising of ADUs is a complicated field, and something that we don't have a lot of. It's challenging to do because there aren't a lot of examples of concentrated ADUs in one geography, so there's not a lot of sales comps, yada yada. So. To come up with a methodology by which to establish a fair way to appraise ADUs has actually been really pivotal in developing opportunities to finance ADUs, so banks understand how much these things are worth. So this Space Efficient Housing Work Group was responsible for making this little project happen. This is an example of a large 800 square foot ADU in the backyard. It's mine, ADU. And the reason I show this slide is to say these things are hard to see from the street. You wouldn't know they were there. If a neighbor was on the street, they wouldn't know that there was this 800 square foot ADU there, let alone the fact that it's like the largest possible ADU you can build. So these things are challenging to see if you don't happen to be invited into one. And as a result of that, Eli, back in around 2009-10, started running these little tiny house tours that included both ADUs and tiny houses on wheels and other kind of cool, small structures. And this was like an informal bike tour, part of Pedalpalooza, which is a really popular event here in Portland. And it was really popular. I attended one of these tours and was kind of blown away by how many people attended. Years later, through the Space Efficient Housing Work Group, and I'm going to go into a lot of these things in a little bit more detail in the Jumpstarting ADU session later. Years later, we started doing the first dedicated ADU tour in Portland. So the tour was a huge success, and just to jump to the kind of the punchline of that, we've now run 5 of those tours. The last tour had 1,200 people in it, and that has been an incredibly valuable way to inform people about ADUs and get them going on their own projects. Among other things, the take-home lessons of this tour are the thing that people care the most about is how much it costs to develop an ADU. So I actually, as a tour organizer, make this a prerequisite. If you want to host on the ADU tour and get paid like nothing and dedicate your whole day to it and kick the renter out for the day, then you also have to be transparent about the building costs of building an ADU, because that's what people care about. If you're not willing to be transparent about the building costs, we're not going to have you on the tour, because I know that's what people care about. So, that's the ADU tour I'll go into more later. The Space Efficient Housing Work Group was also responsible for kicking off the first summit of this sort. So the first Build Small, Live Large summit. This is like the 3rd summit. So this is a legacy of that work group. Other non-regulatory keys to a successful ADU program that were kind of maybe or maybe not so connected to the Space Efficient Housing Work Group were ADU classes that I've ran for a long time, and I'll talk more about that later as well. But as Robert mentioned, I've taught this class now to like 2,000 people, over 1,000 Portland homeowners, and then a whole lot of other people. Local media. So we've had, the point of this slide is to say that having local media coverage and relationships with local media who are able to tell good stories about ADUs is a really important thing. It's really common to see stories about ADUs that talk about the kind of the political strife that they're causing, because ADUs are changing the nature of single-family neighborhoods, and people are upset about the dropping the owner occupancy requirement or changing the codes. But what's happened here in Portland is local media partners from the Oregonian, Portland Tribune, OPB have have done a really great job at covering the positive sides of what ADUs have done for individual people who've built them. It's transformative if you build an ADU. And so getting these local media relationships going so that these good stories can be told has been really valuable in helping to spread awareness about ADUs. We want to give a shout out to the city for having a basic web communication on their website. And I say that because it's not like their website's not like super cool and sexy and fun. It's just like a basic page that has information about ADUs. It has a program guide that goes into zoning codes, building codes. It talks about the fees. It talks about the utility connection issues, and it gives example permit sets. And that's such low-hanging fruit if you want to see ADUs, but surprisingly, most cities don't have a simple web page about ADUs. So this would be something that definitely would be a low-hanging fruit recommendation. Lastly, this is accessorydwellings.org. Through accessorydwellings.org and some other kind of email groups that we've done, we've had to do some political advocacy, so there's definitely been a need at various points in time to get coalitions of people, both homeowners as well as design professionals and building professionals, to work together to address political issues and fight back against political issues that have occurred. For example, we've worked on SDC waiver extension issues, zoning code updates, and property taxation issues. Okay, back to Eli.
And I will say, if you want to steal some of our work on my company, I have a company, Splot.net. There's a little section on my website that's called Open Source Advocacy, where we have the actual letters we have used to advocate at local and regional levels to make this more allowed. So feel free to copy and paste. So some lessons learned. One is that data matters. I'm not going to go in more detail, but whether it's the level of Metro's data in terms of meeting regional housing needs, or just the city being able to count how many ADUs were produced during a year, you have to have that feedback loop to have informed policy. The importance of buzz. If anyone's built an ADU, it's a stressful process. It lasts 9 months. It's exciting. It's risky. And you tell everyone you know about it. It's a water cooler conversation that goes on a long time. And if you haven't built an ADU, you've heard someone talk your ears off about it. So a lot of the way, and it's all the rage in the media. Tiny homes, someone might look at a tiny house and they say, that's awesome, but I want a little bit bigger than that. They end up in an ADU. There's a big role of buzz, and marketers know how this works. We should follow that example. Only a few people will do something because of the energy efficient reason to do it, or lifestyle reasons. Most people will do it because it's cool, keep up with the Joneses, and ADUs are cool right now. Multi-generational housing. I develop co-housing projects. I'm routinely contacted by people who want to move to Portland to be with their new or soon, hopefully, grandkids. We also have lots of people who are young families who their family doesn't live anywhere nearby, but they love to lure grandma out there or grandpa to live on the property with them. And ADUs are a great match for the multi-generational housing situation. As Emily mentioned, it's a fantastic niche for small builders and architects. This is just a small sampling of the folks in Portland who got going with their businesses, building ADUs and designing them. And Portland has room to go further. We have a residential infill project. We're currently in the process. I sit on the Planning Commission in Portland, so this is not up to the Planning Commission yet, but it will be in a few months, where we're changing the zoning for the whole city. And one of the options for that would be to allow a house with 2 ADUs. Now, Vancouver, BC, they're leagues ahead of us. They've been doing this for a while, but it would be new to Portland, so it would have the same massing of a house and a detached garage, but maybe that house has an ADU in the basement, and maybe that detached garage is actually a dwelling unit. It would fit in great. And also, we have an opportunity to try and encourage smaller ADU types that get to lower price points, maybe with some mass production of scale, and make them more available to people who don't have the money to pay for one of the nicer ones that have come out of the gates thus far. So for those of you guys who might be in another city and wondering who actually does this stuff on the ground, there's been a very small army of hardworking volunteer advocates from the communities, professionals, planners and city staff have participated, entrepreneurs like Cole leading the way and training others. A great partnership with Portland State University, and University of Oregon's also assisted with work, and importantly, a convening organization. And this started off, Tiny House Society, Space Efficient Working Group, Build Small Coalition. You've heard those brought up before, but it's really critical having some kind of convener in a community to help galvanize the work of mostly volunteers, maybe a few contracts here and there, to help launch a movement. Now, looking ahead for Portland, and some of this will be covered later on, but a little preview of coming attractions, we're trying to get some affordable ADU initiatives to happen here. ISS is working on one program. Multnomah County is providing ADUs for people who otherwise would be houseless. And Portland Housing Center, our local city agency, is trying to come up with some financing package to help low-income people build ADUs for income security. We have the open question of whether SDCs will be continuing. And Chloe, are they going to continue the waiver? I think we have at least one vote. We need 2 more, at least. There's several groups trying to work on modular ADU models so that they can be more quickly constructed in yards and decrease the cost through efficiency of scale. We haven't seen it roll out yet, but these are all areas where we can do more. And as I mentioned, we've got Portland for Everyone, sort of a big tent YIMBY organization where we're trying to influence the rules of Portland Zoning Code update to ensure that this housing type is broadly available in every neighborhood in our city, more so than it is today. And now I'm going to go over to Robert. And that's our last person before we have a little bit.
So what's next for this movement nationally and for us in the region? And you've heard some of these same points before. Continued regulatory reform is necessary. Perhaps the leader in this right now is California. 3 bills were passed into law in California last year that essentially creates a state requirement for authorizing accessory dwelling units. And if the local governments don't authorize them, you can get your permit from the state. So this is a big shift from local control to address a much higher priority, which is the need to provide affordable housing. What about in our region? Well, you heard that there are some policy choices ahead, both for the City Council and I hope also our Metro Council, which has broad responsibility now that they've identified affordable housing as a matter of regional significance. Another thing we need to do here and nationally is test and understand the types and depths of the ADU market. And I put markets deliberately. So how big a contribution to our housing needs might ADUs be? What demographic groups want to take advantage? We've heard about seniors aging in place. What about singles and single-parent households? New homeowners who want to finance their primary unit? What cities and neighborhoods would this new housing supply be most beneficial? And what are the roles, pluses and minuses of short-term rentals? Now, for a lot of us, they are a problem, but that may be the reason someone builds an ADU, and they might finance the first couple of years through short-term rentals. They might not build it otherwise. We need to understand that better. What are the connections of this market question to other issues of cost finance, facilitation, and taxation? What are we doing here? Well, the Institute for Sustainable Solutions has commissioned 2 bits of research that are important. There is a survey going out to 4,000 ADU owners and tenants and prospective ADU owners. And we're paying $10 to each person who responds, so we expect to have really in-depth data that will supplement what we learned from the DEQ study. And you'll hear some, I think, preliminary results from Professor Matthew Gephardt this afternoon. We also commissioned research by the Northwest Economic Research Center to look at what the market is, to understand some of its segments, and to help us think about what role incentives might play and have played. What about making it easier for homeowners? As you heard, this is the only type of housing where the homeowner becomes an amateur developer. We need to create a suite of services that will make this much easier, kind of a concierge system. Can we replicate the kind of online assistance you see that Solar City provides for solar panels or Airbnb for short-term rentals? Can we then use these services to inform and entice homeowners into contributing to community goals like affordability, equity, and sustainability? Inhabit here is taking the lead with support of ISS in creating both online and in-person concierge assistance services. It'll cover everything from site suitability to financing, financial analysis, finding general contractors and designs, and landlord training or property management services. They will also use this concierge service to connect, we hope, to advancing issues like affordability, equity, wealth creation, sustainability. Expanding ADU financing. Can we expand financing beyond mortgage refinance on home equity lines of credit? Can we create a specialized ADU financing product based on potential revenue stream? What can we do to help develop and build a secondary market for ADU financial instruments? Can we develop a better and consistent ADU appraisal practice? Can we adopt condominium and land lease models as ways of making it easier to finance ADUs? What's happening here in Portland is Dweller, and you'll hear from Patrick Quinton, who's the CEO, is pioneering the idea of paying homeowners to lease their property as a site for ADU that would be owned by Dweller and managed by Dweller, but could be purchased by the homeowner over time. Craft 3, another part of our collaborative effort at the Institute, is working on creating a pooled fund with some risk enhancements to test the feasibility of financing systems for homeowners who lack the necessary cash, equity, or credit worthiness. Craft 3 is building on its prior demonstrated success in providing financing for home improvements for households that haven't qualified for conventional financing. Taking ADU design and construction to scale. This is mostly a private sector initiative. We need a continued growth of designers, planning consultants, contractors, design build firms. We need to test the market for standardized and modular units and components. We need new technologies for raising homes to retrofit them with safe new foundations and ADUs. So in areas with earthquake risk, this can be a very attractive combination package. And making ADUs standard elements in new housing construction. What's happening in Portland? Well, as Eli said, there's been an amazing growth of people specializing in just this kind of work. How do we adapt ADUs to better address affordability and equity? So ADUs are small, so even in high expensive markets, they'll have natural market affordability. Research here and in Edmonton showed a substantial number of them will be provided free or at minimal rent to family or friends that have fallen on hard times. But we may need to find some additional incentives to make them available to households of much more modest means, such as property tax and fee waivers. Can we find ways to use ADUs to provide more housing at lower costs than the expensive subsidized housing units that cost anything from $200,000 to, in Vancouver, $600,000 for a permanently affordable unit? Can we deploy what the market creates to create more affordable housing? Equity overlaps with affordability, but it's not the same thing, because it has other social justice dimensions like helping people to connect to opportunities previously denied them because of racial or economic injustice. Can we use ADUs, for example, as a means of providing access to better schools, connect people to social networks that increase their chance of a healthy and productive life? What's happening in ADUs? The Institute for Sustainable Solutions commissioned the Center for Public Interest Design at PSU to develop lower-cost prototypes for ADUs, significantly below current costs, which is probably north of $150,000 now. They partnered with general contractors, and their plan, our plan, is to build 3 or 5 of the prototypes next year. Again, the Northwest Economic Research Center is going to look at the impacts of incentives, and Multnomah County has adopted Place for You, which gives an ADU to a homeowner if they agree to have it house a homeless person for 5 years. What about adapting ADUs for deeper sustainability and resilience? They can play a role in preparing for disaster, recovering from disaster. Some of them are off the grid, composting toilets, solar panels, water recovery, and so on. So they can be both a solution and preparation. And in Portland, it's now, the city of Portland, it's now required to deconstruct older homes, not demolish them, and that is going to create a big supply of material for reuse. The Center for Public Interest Design wants to see if we can reuse that material, which has a lot of embedded carbon, in building ADUs. And we think it can help a little bit to address the problem with sprawl, a continuing problem which, by the way, is no longer an American problem. All over the world, densities are falling in developed and developing countries. And finally, there's a need for continuing public education. Eli and I were pleased to participate in a conference in Washington, D.C. just a few weeks ago, which had several co-sponsors and was oversubscribed. We will continue that work here, and this conference itself is an important part of that element. What's going to happen today and the rest of the day is we'll hear a lot more about these topics, and we are delighted to have you here because we are going to learn a lot from you. Thank you for joining us.